Derek Hall.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to rise on behalf of New Zealand First to speak on the Social Security Legislation Rewrite Bill. Before I do, sir, I'd just like to take a second to acknowledge the life and work of the pioneer of modern social work in New Zealand and former Palmerston North City Councillor Merv Hancock, who passed away on Saturday. He was the first president of the New Zealand Association of Social Workers, and he was appointed to run the first New Zealand undergraduate degree in social work in New Zealand, and he truly made a difference across many generations and future generations, sir. New Zealand First will be supporting this bill through to Select Committee, sir, but we do have some reservations. We do support the fact that, as the Minister and other members mentioned, that it's been 50 years full of amendments. The intent to clarify the bill and for its ease of reading, New Zealand First supports and obviously aim to improve the administration of the legislation. I'd like to actually mention that I agree with Kamau Supaloni when she said that this was a promised rewrite, not policy changes, and that's exactly what has happened here. And although that the Minister says that they are somewhat small changes, they would have effects. New Zealand First, although we do agree with most of the small changes that the Minister speaks about, I would like to see in the Select Committee, through that process, all of the submissions and evidence to go with it. However, we do have one large concern, and it has been mentioned by both Labour and the Greens also. And all you need to really do is look into the regulatory impact statement, sir, to see how it actually stands out in regards to the writing on policy proposals of this bill. Under the policy proposals, there are 5 of them. If you take 4 of them, sir, you're looking at the removal of an unused provision. It states that there's no changes provided. Another one is about the enabling redirections to be applied to certain groups. Again, no changes to the support. Merging orphans and unsupported child's benefit, talking about a name change, and renaming the emergency benefit exceptional circumstances benefit. So those are 4 of them. And then the other one you've got actually is including support for investment approach in the actual purpose of the Act. So those are 2 very distinct and different things. You're talking about small practical changes that the Minister is talking about, small changes, but then that's versus the inclusion of the investment approach in the purpose of the Act, which is actually the overarching National Party philosophy in the umbrella that is the purpose. So what that means, sir, is that every piece of legislation in the Act and every decision, every deduction and inference has to be tied back to the investment approach. And the question is, what is the investment approach? And when it boils down to it, sir, it is first and foremost National Party mantra and philosophy and MO, but it's about data collection, it's about predictive modelling, targeting of people who are high risk of becoming a liability to the state. And that's about the financial liability to the state. That is what the National Party want to put into the overarching purpose of this bill. And what that states, sir, is that it's all about the financial approach and it's about numbers and not about need. And in theory, really, it works quite well, sir, in business, but not when you're dealing with people. This is a country, not a business. We are dealing with people. We are not dealing with stock. We are not dealing with money. But given that that's the National Party stance and pathway into the Social Services Act or rewrite, you would assume, hopefully quite rightly, that if it's being put into the purpose, that they would know that it would work. But it's actually the contrary to that, sir. And not only do we have evidence that it doesn't work that the government actually comes up with themselves, but we actually have international evidence that the investment approach does not work. And I'd just like to highlight, going back to the regulatory impact statement, sir, I'd like to highlight the fact that this is actually not a small change. Putting it into the purpose of the Act is not a small change. The Supreme Court, this is quoting from the regulatory impact statement, sir, the Supreme Court has said, even if the meaning of the text may appear plain in isolation of purpose, that meaning should always be cross-checked against purpose in order to observe the dual requirements. That is not a minor change that the Minister spoke about. And in fact, I'd like it highlighted the fact that the Minister didn't even talk about the investment approach being included in the purpose of the Act in this entire first speech. It also goes on, Sir, to state in the very first sentence of their definition in supporting the investment approach is that it applies to long-term liability perspective to the cost of the benefit system. And it talks about client outcomes and overall liability. And again, as I mentioned, Sir, it's about the financial liability to the state. And it's a new approach to welfare, is not well supported in the current wording of the Act. And it's not supported in the current wording of the Act because this is new and it's a social experiment that the National Party is wanting to put into legislation. They talk about the key building blocks, Sir, and a few of them that I'll mention. They talk about the actuarial valuation, which I must mention hasn't been done yet, especially in regards to the SIFS overhaul. And it identifies clients who should focus on based how long they might stay on a benefit. It's based on how long they might stay on a benefit. That is written in the regulatory impact statement. So why isn't it based on the need of the individual? Why is it based on how long they may stay on the benefit? It talks about the fact that it's actually trialling new approaches and seeing what works best. They still are trialling new approaches and to see what works best. They don't know that the investment approach actually works or not. And then they start talking about the goals, Sir, and how they measure it. And they go back to talk about the better public service targets that this government has implemented in 2012 and that they haven't yet evaluated. They have not had an independent review or evaluation of the better public service targets since their inception. The government made the target, they reviewed the target themselves, they changed the target themselves, and then they come out to in the House and to the public and say how well they're doing. They test it themselves. Obviously, that's not a good position to be in, and it was highlighted actually not too long ago by the Salvation Army when they talked about the moving targets. The moving targets was the title of their actual annual report. And they say it is an allusion to the way in which some government agencies appear to be using targets and the numbers behind them in a less than straightforward and reliable manner. While the targets may not change with such practices, the meaning behind them can. So it's not actually mindless criticism like the Honourable Chris Finlayson said. There are very reputable organisations that have evidence that it is not working, Sir. And when it boils down to it, Sir, this is a social experiment currently being run by the national government. If we look at even some of the international and what the government says themselves in regards to data collection, because if we're talking about the investment approach, we're talking about the targets that are being measured with, and we're talking about the data that needs to be collected to maintain those targets. And Statistics New Zealand, on the government's website themselves, they say that some of the methods used are exploratory, so results are indicative only and not accurate estimates or forecasts of the outcomes and costs that will be incurred in the future. This is the government's own website, Statistics New Zealand, talking about the social investment insights. The scope of the data is limited by the information collected in agencies, administrative systems. Data provides only a partial picture of childhood adversity, service use and service costs. This is the information that the government has available to them, and they're still making the decisions to put this in the entire purpose of the Act, that every piece of law that has been implemented in regards to social services has to be rely on the purpose that they don't even know works in the first place. I'd just like to finish, Sir, by quoting some international research on the investment approach and data collection. Stanford Social Innovation Review. And they say, beyond the infrastructural impediments that social sector users of big data face, data itself can be the problem. Oftentimes data is missing and incomplete or stored in silos or in forms that are inaccessible in automated processing. So what they're saying, Sir, is that even though the investment approach is based on data, the data is limited in itself. The data is limited in itself. And you run the chance of focusing on the data that you have and ignoring the data that you don't have. You'll be ignoring on the victims, not on the situation that they're in and what caused them to be victims in the first place, Sir. So we will be supporting this bill through the first reading to Select Committee, but we have massive reservations, and hopefully those questions can be answered and the concerns can be mitigated later on through the process. Thank you, sir.